Introduction to The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 1, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction, Part 1. Polar exploration is at once the cleanest and most isolated way of having a bad time which has been devised. It is the only form of adventure in which you put your clothes on at Michaelmas and keep them on until Christmas, and, save for a layer of the natural grease of the body, find them as clean as though they were new. It is more lonely than London, more secluded than any monastery, and the post comes but once a year. As men will compare the hardships of France, Palestine, or Mesopotamia, so it would be interesting to contrast the rival claims of the Antarctic as a medium of discomfort. A member of Campbell's party tells me that the trenches at Ypres were a comparative picnic, but until somebody can evolve a standard of endurance I am unable to see how it can be done. Take it all in all, I do not believe anybody on earth has a worse time than an emperor penguin. Even now the Antarctic is to the rest of the earth as the abode of the gods was to the ancient Chaldees, a precipitous and mammoth land lying far beyond the seas which encircled man's habitation. And nothing is more striking about the exploration of the southern polar regions than its absence, for when King Alfred reigned in England the Vikings were navigating the ice fields of the north, yet when Wellington fought the Battle of Waterloo there was still an undiscovered continent in the south. For those who wish to read an account of the history of Antarctic exploration, there is an excellent chapter in Scott's Voyage of the Discovery and elsewhere. I do not propose to give any general survey of this kind here, but complaints have been made to me that Scott's last expedition plunges the general reader into a neighbourhood which he is supposed to know all about, while actually he is lost, having no idea what the Discovery was, or where Castle Rock or Hut Point stand. For the better understanding of the references to particular expeditions, to the lands discovered by them, and the traces left by them, which must occur in this book, I give the following brief introduction. From the earliest days of the making of maps of the southern hemisphere, it was supposed that there was a great continent called Terra Australis. As explorers penetrated round the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, and found nothing but stormy oceans beyond, and as later they discovered Australia and New Zealand, the belief in this continent weakened, but was not abandoned. During the latter half of the 18th century, eagerness for scientific knowledge was added to the former striving after individual or state aggrandizement. Cook, Ross and Scott. These are the aristocrats of the south. It was the great English navigator James Cook who laid the foundations of our knowledge. In 1772 he sailed from Bedford in the Resolution, 462 tons, and the Adventure, 336 tons, ships which had been built at Whitby for the coal trade. He was, like Nansen, a believer in a varied diet as one of the preventives of scurvy, and mentions that he had among his provisions, besides sauerkraut, portable broth, marmalade of carrots, and suspissated juice of wort and beer. Medals were struck to be given to the natives of new discovered countries and left there as testimonies of our being the first discoverers. It would be interesting to know whether any exist now. After calling at the Cape of Good Hope, Cook started to make his easting down to New Zealand, purposing to sail as far as south as possible in search of a southern continent. He sighted his first ice island or iceberg in latitude 50 degrees 40 minutes south, longitude 2 degrees 0 minutes east, on December 10th, 1772. The next day he saw some white birds about the size of pigeons, with blackish bills and feet. I never saw any such before. These must have been snowy petrel. Passing through many bergs where he notices how the albatross left them and penguins appeared, he was brought up by thick pack ice, along which he coasted. Under the supposition that this ice was formed in bays and rivers, Cook was led to believe that land was not far distant. Incidentally he remarks that in order to enable his men to support the colder weather, he caused the sleeves of their jackets, which were so short as to expose their arms, to be lengthened with baize, and had a cap made for each man of the same stuff, together with canvas, which proved of great service to them. For more than a month Cook sailed the Southern Ocean, always among bergs and often among pack. The weather was consistently bad and generally thick. He mentions that he had only seen the moon once since leaving the Cape. It was on Sunday, January 17, 1773, that the Antarctic Circle was crossed for the first time, in longitude 39 degrees 35 minutes east. After proceeding to latitude 67 degrees 15 minutes south, he was stopped by an immense field of pack. From this point he turned back and made his way to New Zealand. Leaving New Zealand at the end of 1773 without his second ship, the Adventure, from which he had been parted, he judged from the great swell that there can be no land to the southward under the meridian of New Zealand, but what must lie very far to the south. In latitude 62 degrees 10 minutes south he sighted the first ice island on December 12th and was stopped by thick pack ice 3 days later. On the 20th he again crossed the Antarctic Circle in longitude 147 degrees 46 minutes west, and penetrated in this neighbourhood to a latitude of 67 degrees 31 minutes south. Here he found a drift towards the north-east. On January 26, 1774, in longitude 109 degrees 31 minutes west, he crossed the Antarctic Circle for the third time, after meeting no pack and only a few icebergs. In latitude 71 degrees 10 minutes south he was finally turned back by an immense field of pack, and wrote, "I will not say it was impossible anywhere to get farther to the south, but the attempting it would have been a dangerous and rash enterprise, and what, I believe, no man in my situation would have thought of. It was indeed my opinion, as well as the opinion of most on board, that this ice extended quite to the pole, or perhaps joined to some land, to which it had been fixed from the earliest time, and that it is here, that is to the south of this parallel, where all the ice we find scattered up and down to the north is first formed, and afterwards broken off by gales of wind or other causes, and brought to the north by the currents, which are always found to set in that direction in the high latitudes. As we drew near this ice, some penguins were heard, but none seen, and but few other birds, or any other thing that could induce us to think any land was near. And yet I think there must be some to the south beyond this ice, but if there is, it can afford no better retreat for birds or any other animals than the ice itself, with which it must be wholly covered. I, who had ambition not only to go farther than any one had been before, but as far as it was possible for a man to go, was not sorry at meeting with this interruption, as it in some measure relieved us, at least shortened the danger and hardships inseparable from the navigation of the southern polar regions." And so he turned northwards when, being taken ill of the bilious colic, a favourite dog belonging to one of the officers, Mr. Forster, after whom Aptenodytes forsteri, the emperor penguin, is named, fell a sacrifice to my tender stomach. Thus I received nourishment and strength from food which would have made most people in Europe sick. So true it is that necessity is governed by no law. Once and for all the idea of a populous, fertile southern continent was proved to be a myth, and it was clearly shown that whatever land might exist to the south must be a region of desolation, hidden beneath a mantle of ice and snow. The vast extent of the tempestuous southern seas was revealed, and the limits of the habitable globe were made known. Incidentally, it may be remarked that Cook was the first to describe the peculiarities of the Antarctic icebergs and floe ice. A Russian expedition under Bellingshausen discovered the first certain land in the Antarctic in 1819 and called it Alexander Land, which lies nearly due south of Cape Horn. Whatever may have been the rule in other parts of the world, the flag followed trade in the southern seas during the first part of the 19th century. The discovery of large numbers of seals and whales attracted many hundreds of ships, and it is to the enlightened instructions of such firms as Messrs. Enderby, and to the pluck and enterprise of such commanders as Weddell, Biscoe, and Balleny, that we owe much of our small knowledge of the outline of the Antarctic continent. In the smallest and craziest ships they plunged boldly into stormy ice-strewn seas. Again and again they narrowly missed disaster. Their vessels were racked and strained and leaked badly. Their crews were worn out with unceasing toil and decimated with scurvy. Yet in spite of inconceivable discomforts they struggled on, and it does not appear that any one of them ever turned his course until he was driven to do so by hard necessity. One cannot read the simple, unaffected narratives of these voyages without being assured of their veracity, and without being struck by the wonderful pertinacity and courage which they display. The position in 1840 was that the Antarctic land had been sighted at a few points all around its coasts. On the whole, the boundaries which had been seen lay on or close to the Antarctic Circle, and it appeared probable that the continent, if continent it was, consisted of a great circular mass of land with the South Pole at its centre, and its coasts more or less equidistant from this point. Two exceptions only to this had been found. Cook and Bellinghausen had indicated a dip towards the pole south of the Pacific. Weddell a still more pronounced dip to the south of the Atlantic, having sailed to a latitude of 74 degrees 15 minutes south in longitude 34 degrees 16 minutes west. Had there been a tetrahedronal theory in those days, some one might have suggested the probability of a third indentation beneath the Indian Ocean, probably to be laughed at for his pains. When James Clark Ross started from England in 1839, there was no particular reason for him to suppose that the Antarctic coastline in the region of the magnetic pole which he was trying to reach did not continue to follow the Antarctic Circle. Ross left England in September 1839 under instructions from the Admiralty. He had under his command two of Her Majesty's sailing ships, the Erebus 370 tons and the Terror 340 tons. Arriving in Hobart, Tasmania, in August 1840, he was met by news of discoveries made during the previous summer by the French expedition under Dumont d'Urville and the United States expedition under Charles Wilkes. The former had coasted along Adélie Land and for 60 miles of ice cliff to the west of it. He brought back an egg, now at Drayton, which Scott's Discovery expedition definitely proved to be that of an emperor penguin. All these discoveries were somewhere about the latitude of the Antarctic Circle, 66 degrees 32 minutes south, and roughly in that part of the world which lies to the south of Australia. Ross, impressed with the feeling that England had ever led the way of discovery in the southern as well as in the northern region, resolved at once to avoid all interference with their discoveries, and selected a much more easterly meridian, 170 degrees east, on which to penetrate to the southward, and if possible reach the magnetic pole. The outlines of the expedition, in which an unknown and unexpected sea was found, stretching 500 miles southwards towards the pole, are well known to students of Antarctic history. After passing through the pack, he stood towards the supposed position of the magnetic pole, steering as nearly south by the compass as the wind admitted, and on January 11, 1841, in latitude 71 degrees 15 minutes south, he sighted the white peaks of Mount Sabine and shortly afterwards Cape Adare. Foiled by the presence of land from gaining the magnetic pole, he turned southwards, true, into what is now called the Ross Sea, and after spending many days in travelling down this coastline with the mountains on his right hand, the Ross Sea on his left, he discovered and named the great line of mountains which here for some 500 miles divides the sea from the Antarctic plateau. On January 27th, with a favourable breeze and very clear weather, we stood to the southward, close to some land which had been in sight since the preceding noon, and which we then called the High Island. It proved to be a mountain 12,400 feet of elevation above the level of the sea, emitting flame and smoke in great profusion. At first the smoke appeared like a snowdrift, but as we drew nearer its true character became manifest. I named it Mount Erebus, and an extinct volcano to the eastward, a little inferior in height, being by measurement 10,900 feet high, was called Mount Terror. That is the first we hear of our two old friends, and Ross Island is the land upon which they stand. As we approached the land under all studding sails, we perceived a low white line extending from its eastern extreme point as far as the eye could discern to the eastward. It presented an extraordinary appearance, gradually increasing in height as we got nearer to it, and proving at length to be a perpendicular cliff of ice, between 150 and 200 feet above the level of the sea, perfectly flat and level at the top, and without any fissures or promontories on its even seaward face. Ross coasted along the barrier for some 250 miles from Cape Crozier, as he called the eastern extremity of Ross Island, after the commander of the Terror. This point where land, sea and moving barrier meet will be constantly mentioned in this narrative. Returning, he looked into the sound which divides Ross Island from the Western Mountains. On February 16th, Mount Erebus was seen at 2:30 a.m. and, the weather becoming very clear, we had a splendid view of the whole line of coast, to all appearance connecting it with the mainland, which we had not before suspected to be the case. The reader will understand that Ross makes a mistake here, since Mount Erebus and Terra are upon an island connected to the mainland only by a sheet of ice. He continues, "A very deep bight was observed to extend far to the south-west from Cape Bird" (Bird was the senior lieutenant of the Erebus), "in which a line of low land might be seen, but its determination was too uncertain to be left unexplored, and as the wind blowing feebly from the west prevented our making any way in that direction through the young ice that now covered the surface of the ocean in every part, as far as we could see from the masthead, I determined to steer towards the bight to give it a closer examination, and to learn with more certainty its continuity or otherwise. At noon we were in latitude 76 degrees 32 minutes south, longitude 166 degrees 12 minutes east, dip 88 degrees 24 minutes, and variation 107 degrees 18 minutes east. During the afternoon we were nearly becalmed, and witnessed some magnificent eruptions from Mount Erebus, the flame and smoke being projected to a great height, but we could not, as on a former occasion, discover any lava issuing from the crater, although the exhibitions of to-day were upon a much grander scale. Soon after midnight, February 16th-17th, a breeze sprang up from the eastward, and we made all sail to the southward until 4 a.m., although we had an hour before distinctly traced the land entirely round the bay connecting Mount Erebus with the mainland. I named it McMurdo Bay, after the senior lieutenant on the Terra, a compliment that his zeal and skill well merited. It is now called McMurdo Sound. In making the mistake of connecting Erebus with the mainland, Ross was looking at a distance upon the Hut Point Peninsula, running out from the southwest corner of Erebus towards the west. He probably saw Minna Bluff, which juts out from the mainland towards the east. Between them, and in front of the bluff, lie White Island, Black Island, and Brown Island. To suppose them to be part of a line of continuous land was a very natural mistake. Ross broke through the pack ice into an unknown sea. He laid down many hundreds of miles of mountainous coastline, and, with further work completed in 1842, some 400 miles of the Great Ice Barrier. He penetrated in his ships to the extraordinarily high latitude of 78 degrees 11 minutes south, 4 degrees farther than Weddell. The scientific work of his expedition was no less worthy of praise. The South Magnetic Pole was fixed with comparative accuracy, though Ross was disappointed in his natural but perhaps too ambitious hope I had so long cherished of being permitted to plant the flag of my country on both the magnetic poles of our globe. Before all things, he was at great pains to be accurate, both in his geographical and scientific observations and his records of meteorology, water temperatures, soundings, as also those concerning the life in the oceans through which he passed, were not only frequent but trustworthy. When Ross returned to England in 1843, it was impossible not to believe that the case of those who advocated the existence of a South Polar continent was considerably strengthened. At the same time, there was no proof that the various blocks of land which had been discovered were connected with one another. Even now, in 1921, after 20 years of determined exploration, aided by the most modern appliances, the interior of this supposed continent is entirely unknown and uncharted except in the Ross Sea area, while the fringes of the land are only discovered in perhaps a dozen places on a circumference of about 11,000 miles. In his life of Sir Joseph Hooker, Dr. Leonard Huxley has given us some interesting sidelights on this expedition under Ross. Hooker was the botanist of the expedition and assistant surgeon to the Erebus, being 22 years old when he left England in 1839. Natural history came off very badly in the matter of equipment from the government, who provided 25 reams of paper, 2 botanizing vascula, and 2 cases for bringing home live plants. That was all. Not an instrument, nor a book, nor a bottle, and rum from the ship's stores was the only preservative. And when they returned, the rich collections which they brought back were never fully worked out. Ross's special branch of science was terrestrial magnetism, but he was greatly interested in the natural history, and gave up part of his cabin for Hooker to work in. Almost every day I draw, sometimes all day long, until 2 and 3 in the morning, the captain directing me. He sits on one side of the table, writing and figuring at night, and I on the other, drawing. Every now and then he breaks off and comes to my side to see what I am after, and, as you may suppose, we have had 1 or 2 little tiffs, neither of us perhaps being helped by the best of tempers, but nothing can exceed the liberality with which he has thrown open his cabin to me, and made it my workroom at no little inconvenience to himself. Another extract from Hooker's letters after the first voyage runs as follows: "The success of the expedition in geographical discovery is really wonderful, and only shows what a little perseverance will do, for we have been in no dangerous predicaments, and have suffered no hardships whatever. There has been a sort of freemasonry among polar voyagers to keep up the credit they have acquired as having done wonders, and accordingly such of us as were new to the ice made up our minds for frostbites, and attached a most undue importance to the simple operation of boring packs, etc., which have now vanished, though I am not going to tell everybody so. I do not here refer to travellers, who do indeed undergo unheard of hardships, but to voyagers, who have a snug ship, a little knowledge of the ice, and due caution is all that is required." In the light of Scott's leading of the expedition of which I am about to tell, and the extraordinary scientific activity of Pennell in command of the Terra Nova after Scott had landed, Hooker would have to qualify a later extract: "Nor is it probable that any future collector will have a captain so devoted to the cause of marine zoology, and so constantly on the alert to snatch the most trifling opportunities of adding to the collection." Finally, we have a picture of the secrecy which was imposed upon all with regard to the news they should write home, and the precautions against any leakage of scientific results. And we see Hooker jumping down the main hatch with a penguin skin in his hand which he was preparing for himself, when Ross came up the after hatch unexpectedly. That has happened on the Terra Nova. Ross had a cold reception on his return, and Scott wrote to Hooker in 1905. At first it seems inexplicable when one considers how highly his work is now appreciated. From the point of view of the general public, however, I have always thought that Ross was neglected, and, as you once said, he is very far from doing himself justice in his book. I did not know that Barrow was the bête noire who did so much to discount Ross's results. It is an interesting sidelight on such a venture." In discussing and urging the importance of the Antarctic Expedition, which was finally sent under Scott in the Discovery, Hooker urged the importance of work in the South Polar Ocean, which swarms with animal and vegetable life. Commenting upon the fact that the large collections made chiefly by himself had never been worked out, except the diatoms, he writes: "A better fate, I trust, awaits the treasures that the hoped-for expedition will bring back, for so prolific is the ocean that the naturalist need never be idle, no, not even for one of the 24 hours of daylight during a whole Antarctic summer, and I look to the results of a comparison of the oceanic life of the Arctic and Antarctic regions as the heralding of an epoch in the history of biology." When Ross went to the Antarctic it was generally thought that there was neither food nor oxygen nor light in the depths of the ocean, and that therefore there was no life. Among other things, the investigations of Ross gave ground for thinking this was not the case. Later still, in 1873, the possibility of laying submarine cables made it necessary to investigate the nature of the abyssal depths, and the Challenger proved that not only does life, and in quite high forms, exist there, but that there are fish which can see. It is now almost certain that there is a great oxidized northward creeping current which flows out of the Antarctic Ocean and under the waters of the other great oceans of the world. It was the good fortune of Ross, at a time when the fringes of the great Antarctic continent were being discovered in comparatively low attitudes of 66 degrees and thereabouts, sometimes not even within the Antarctic Circle, to find to the south of New Zealand a deep inlet in which he could sail to the high latitude of 78 degrees. This inlet, which is now known as the Ross Sea, has formed the starting place of all sledging parties which have approached the South Pole. I have dwelt upon this description of the lands he discovered because they will come very intimately into this history. I have also emphasized his importance in the history of Antarctic exploration because Ross, having done what it was possible to do by sea, Penetrating so far south and making such memorable discoveries, the next necessary step in Antarctic exploration was that another traveller should follow up his work on land. It is an amazing thing that 60 years were allowed to elapse before that traveller appeared. When he appeared he was Scott. In the 60 years which elapsed between Ross and Scott, the map of the Antarctic remained practically unaltered. Scott tackled the land, and Scott is the father of Antarctic sledge travelling. End of introduction, part 1.